On the afternoon of April 12, 1945, Harry S. Truman walked through the doors of the White House believing he was being summoned for a routine meeting. He had spent the day on Capitol Hill, speaking briefly with House leaders, reviewing legislation, and trying to understand the shifting political landscape of a nation still at war. Nothing in his schedule suggested that history was about to change. Nothing hinted that the weight of global leadership was about to fall on him without warning. But as he stepped into the cabinet room, the faces that greeted him told the truth before anyone spoke. Somber, pale, unsteady. Eleanor Roosevelt rose from her seat, took a slow breath, and delivered the words that ended one presidency and began another. "Harry," she said softly, "the president is dead." Truman felt the world tilt. He asked whether there was anything he could do for her. She shook her head and replied, "Is there anything we can do for you? You're the one in trouble now." And she was right. He was. But what Truman didn't yet realize was that the trouble wasn't only the suddenness of Roosevelt's death. It wasn't simply stepping into the Oval Office at the most dangerous moment in modern history. And it wasn't just inheriting a war on two fronts with no transition, no briefing, and no warning. Before we go further, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. And if you enjoy content like this, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next video. The deeper trouble, the one Truman would discover within hours, was that many of the decisions Roosevelt had made in his final months were about to backfire on the man now tasked with carrying them out. For Roosevelt, these choices had been shaped by exhaustion, by secrecy, and by a belief that he alone could manage the war's final phase. For Truman, those same decisions would become obstacles, traps, and in some cases crises he had never been prepared to face. To understand what Truman stepped into, you must understand what Roosevelt left behind. A world shaped by bold promises, ambiguous agreements, personal diplomacy, and assumptions that worked only as long as Roosevelt himself remained at the center. When he died, those decisions did not die with him. They landed directly on Truman's desk. And the moment he became president, they began to unravel. In the hours after taking the oath, Truman was escorted to the Oval Office. He stood silently for a long moment, absorbing the magnitude of the task Roosevelt had left him. The desk was covered in papers Roosevelt had been reviewing earlier that day. Maps of the Pacific War, drafts of upcoming diplomatic messages, communications from Yalta whose meaning Truman barely understood. Decisions Roosevelt had postponed, decisions he had made privately, decisions he had made verbally without paper trails, decisions he had shared with only a few trusted advisors. Truman knew none of it. His first meeting that night was with Secretary of War Henry Stimson. Truman, still processing the shock, sat at Roosevelt's desk as Stimson delivered the first revelation. There was a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. A weapon developed in secrecy since 1942. A weapon capable of ending the war in the Pacific in a matter of weeks. The atomic bomb. Roosevelt had never told him. Truman listened quietly, his face tightening as the implications sank in. A weapon powerful enough to alter the future of warfare had been kept from the man now responsible for deciding whether it would be used. If Roosevelt's intention had been to carry the burden alone, he had also left Truman with a burden of unimaginable weight. And the bomb was only the beginning. The second revelation came in the form of an urgent cable from Europe. Allied commanders were requesting guidance on how to interpret the promises Roosevelt had made at Yalta regarding Eastern Europe. The agreements were vague, some were contradictory, some had been delivered orally to Stalin in private meetings, and now Soviet forces were moving aggressively, filling the vacuum left behind by the retreating Germans. Truman had no idea what Roosevelt had promised. He had not been told about the fragile balance Roosevelt had maintained with Churchill and Stalin, a balance held together more by Roosevelt's personality than by written agreements. Truman received cables from Churchill asking for immediate clarification, messages from American diplomats requesting instructions, reports from commanders in Germany warning that the situation was shifting faster than policy could keep up. Roosevelt's decisions, strategic, personal, often undocumented, were now Truman's problem. The third backfiring decision came from within the administration itself. Roosevelt had relied heavily on a small inner circle, Harry Hopkins, Admiral Leahy, Stimson, and a handful of others, while sidelining the vice president and much of the cabinet. These men understood Roosevelt's unspoken intentions, his secret channels, his private agreements, They expected Truman to understand them too, but Truman had not been included in their world. In his first week, Truman learned that several major decisions Roosevelt had made were unclear even to his own advisors. Some assumed Roosevelt wanted one thing. Some believed he wanted another. Without Roosevelt to interpret his own intentions, the administration began to drift. The fourth backfiring decision was perhaps the most personal. Roosevelt had allowed his relationship with Churchill to deteriorate in his final year, not out of hostility, but out of exhaustion. At Yalta, Roosevelt had publicly dismissed Churchill's warnings about Stalin. He had chosen to prioritize Soviet cooperation over British concerns. He had believed Churchill's fears were exaggerated, even outdated. Now Churchill expected Truman to reverse the trend, to confront Soviet ambitions, to reaffirm British-American unity, to reassert Western influence in Eastern Europe. But Truman had no insight into Roosevelt's reasoning. He did not know what Churchill had been promised privately or dismissed publicly. He was left to reconstruct the final phase of Roosevelt's diplomacy with fragments, memories, and incomplete notes. The fifth backfiring decision came from Roosevelt's plan for post-war Japan. Roosevelt had left no clear strategy for occupation, transition, or reconstruction. Some advisors believed Roosevelt wanted a harsh settlement. Others believed he preferred a more lenient approach. Truman inherited a situation in the Pacific that required immediate action but lacked coherent direction. Every day, Truman discovered a new gap, a missing policy, a missing explanation, a missing link in Roosevelt's chain of decisions. And the consequences appeared immediately. Within 2 weeks of taking office, Truman found himself facing a crisis in Europe. Soviet officials were tightening their control over Poland, ignoring the vague promises made at Yalta about free elections. Churchill demanded action. American diplomats warned that the West risked losing credibility if Truman remained passive. But what had Roosevelt intended? What exactly had he promised Stalin? What leverage had he used? And what leverage had he given away? Truman searched through Yalta documents, but the agreements were frustratingly ambiguous. They reflected Roosevelt's confidence that he could manage Stalin personally, confidence Truman did not share, and which he now realized had been unique to Roosevelt alone. When Truman asked his advisors why certain clauses had been left vague, many shrugged. The president preferred flexibility, they said. He liked room to maneuver. But Roosevelt's flexibility had become Truman's trap. Roosevelt had mastered the art of improvisation. Truman preferred clarity. That gap between improvisation and clarity became the defining challenge of Truman's early presidency. As he met with Churchill at Potsdam, Truman saw firsthand what Roosevelt's decisions had created, a Europe on the brink of division. Churchill warned him that Soviet intentions were not temporary or defensive. They were strategic, deliberate, and long-term. Truman listened, realizing that Churchill was not simply offering advice. He was presenting Truman with a crisis Roosevelt had not resolved. Truman began to understand the full weight of the choices Roosevelt had left him. The promise of free elections in Eastern Europe had been made without enforcement mechanisms. The boundaries of post-war Germany had been agreed to without clear guidelines. The structure of the United Nations had been crafted with Roosevelt's personal diplomacy in mind. The war in the Pacific had been planned to end under conditions Roosevelt had never fully explained. And now, Truman was responsible for interpreting, defending, or revising decisions he had played no part in creating. For a man who valued directness, this was a nightmare. In private moments, Truman told his aides he felt as though he were reading a book with half the pages missing. He often searched Roosevelt's old files for clues, but so much of Roosevelt's decision-making existed only in conversations, in instincts, in the private calculus of a man who had governed for 12 years, and believed he understood the world better than those around him. Truman respected Roosevelt deeply, but he also realized that Roosevelt had left him a world held together by threads that snapped the moment he was gone. And yet, Truman did not complain. He went to work. He gathered advisors daily, pressing them for explanations, demanding honesty even when the answers were uncomfortable. He sought clarity where Roosevelt had preferred ambiguity. And slowly, Truman began turning Roosevelt's unfinished plans into actionable policy. He clarified the U.S. position on Eastern Europe. He pushed for a stronger American role in post-war reconstruction. He demanded a clear strategy for the Pacific. He used the atomic bomb decision, arguably the most consequential choice Roosevelt had left him, to end the war and prevent a prolonged invasion that could cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Each decision was shaped by the same reality. Truman was forced to complete a presidency he never had the chance to observe. And in doing so, he discovered something Roosevelt had never confronted. A presidency built on secrecy can last only as long as the man who builds it. But when that man is gone, his choices, especially his final ones, do not disappear. They fall to the successor to make sense of. And for Truman, that successor, the backfiring of Roosevelt's final decisions, became both his greatest challenge and the crucible that forged the presidency he would ultimately build. As Truman settled into the early weeks of his presidency, the scope of what Roosevelt had left him began to widen. The more he learned, the more he realized that Roosevelt's final decisions had not been crafted with transition in mind. They had been crafted for Roosevelt himself, for his instincts, his relationships, his vision of how the world should move after the war. Without Roosevelt to execute them, they sat in Truman's hands like intricate machinery, built without instructions. And Truman, pragmatic by nature, had to figure out how each piece fit together before the entire structure collapsed. He discovered another problem almost immediately. Roosevelt had relied heavily on back-channel communications with foreign leaders. Some messages between Roosevelt and Churchill existed only in partial notes. Others between Roosevelt and Stalin existed only in memory, private discussions held in small rooms behind closed doors at Tehran and Yalta. Truman's aides could summarize the conversations, but they couldn't replicate the tone, the trust, or the personal leverage Roosevelt had used. So, when Stalin tested the boundaries of Yalta, Truman had no sense of how firm or flexible Roosevelt had been in those meetings. He didn't know which warnings Roosevelt had given or withheld. He didn't know what expectations Stalin had walked away with. Roosevelt's decisions had been made with the assumption that he would be there to carry them forward. But now Truman was expected to interpret promises he never heard and enforce agreements he never negotiated. And the most pressing of those agreements involved Poland. At Yalta, Roosevelt had agreed to a broadly representative government in Poland, a phrase vague enough to mean anything and specific enough to mean nothing. Stalin took it to mean Soviet-style oversight. Churchill took it to mean free elections. Roosevelt had kept each man satisfied with words that sounded reassuring but offered no concrete mechanism to resolve the conflicting expectations. Now, Stalin moved quickly, tightening Soviet control over the region while claiming to honor the agreements. Churchill protested, sending Truman messages warning that Soviet intentions were far more aggressive than Roosevelt had believed. Truman read reports from American diplomats confirming Churchill's concerns. Yet, in Roosevelt's final weeks, he had told advisors that he trusted Stalin's assurances. Was that trust genuine, or was it a tactic Roosevelt knew how to manage but never explained? Truman had no way of knowing, and so he had to define American policy on his own terms, not Roosevelt's. His first instinct was to demand clarity. He instructed the State Department to prepare a full summary of every commitment made at Yalta, written, spoken, implied. The report he received was less helpful than he hoped. It revealed just how broad Roosevelt's approach had been, and how much depended on Roosevelt's personal relationship with Stalin. That relationship had died with him. Truman realized that the moment Roosevelt passed, so did the last thread holding the cooperative facade together. The same cracks appeared in Germany. Roosevelt had supported a plan for a united, demilitarized Germany managed jointly by the Allied powers. But as the occupation zones took shape, the Soviets began asserting unilateral control in their sector. Churchill urged Truman to adopt a harder line. American commanders requested new guidance. But Roosevelt had left no detailed plan, only the belief that cooperation would continue. That belief evaporated quickly. In the Pacific, Roosevelt's decisions were equally unfinished. He had planned the invasion of Japan, but his intentions for post-war governance were not written clearly. General MacArthur sent Truman detailed questions about occupation strategy. Would Japan retain the emperor? How should political reform be handled? What would reconstruction look like? Truman sought answers in Roosevelt's papers, but found little more than broad concepts, none of which offered the precision MacArthur needed. It became clear that the presidency Truman inherited had been built around Roosevelt's unique leadership style, intuitive, improvisational, deeply personal. It was a system that worked only as long as Roosevelt lived. Truman, who valued transparency and structure, now had to retrofit the presidency with the mechanisms Roosevelt had never established. He began by reorganizing the flow of information. He demanded strategic briefings from each major department. He insisted that all foreign policy directives be documented, not delivered verbally. He confronted advisors who resisted the shift, reminding them that he could not lead effectively if he remained in the dark. Some welcomed the change. Others quietly resented it, believing Truman's approach lacked Roosevelt's finesse. But Truman didn't care. He was not Roosevelt, and he refused to pretend otherwise. As he corrected the gaps in Roosevelt's plans, he also encountered another consequence of Roosevelt's final decisions: the strain placed on America's alliances. Churchill trusted Truman's instincts, but the British Prime Minister could not forget how Roosevelt had dismissed his warnings in the final months. Stalin tested Truman repeatedly, probing whether the new president lacked Roosevelt's subtlety. American allies in Europe waited anxiously to see whether Truman would continue Roosevelt's approach or adopt something entirely new. Truman responded by defining his own strategy, one grounded in clarity rather than charisma. He made it clear to Churchill that America would not blindly follow British direction, but neither would it ignore Soviet aggression. He communicated to Stalin that vague agreements would no longer be interpreted generously. He informed American diplomats that ambiguity was no longer acceptable. Each of these actions signaled a shift. Roosevelt had governed as an improvisational architect. Truman was becoming a structural engineer. The turning point came at Potsdam. For Truman, the conference was not merely a diplomatic meeting. It was the moment he would confront the full consequences of Roosevelt's decisions. Truman arrived at Potsdam determined to understand what Roosevelt had promised, what needed to be renegotiated, and what had to be abandoned entirely. As he faced Churchill and Stalin, both men seasoned in the art of diplomacy, Truman held his ground. He refused to make assumptions based on Roosevelt's personal approach. He insisted that agreements be written clearly, publicly, and with enforceable mechanisms. He pushed back when Stalin made sweeping claims about Eastern Europe. He clarified America's position on Germany. He asserted American authority in a way Roosevelt never had to, because Roosevelt had relied on relationships Truman did not possess. The Allies quickly realized that Roosevelt's death had fundamentally changed the dynamic. Truman was not his predecessor. His style was direct, his expectations firm, his patience limited. In the final days of the conference, Truman received confirmation that the atomic bomb had been successfully tested. It was a moment that crystallized everything he had inherited and everything he had reshaped. This was Roosevelt's most significant unfinished decision, one Truman now had to complete. The weapon Roosevelt had kept secret, the decision Roosevelt had postponed, the burden Roosevelt had carried alone, Truman now held it all. And unlike Roosevelt, Truman believed in clear, decisive action. The bomb had been developed to end the war without a prolonged invasion. Truman concluded that using it would save lives, American and Japanese alike. And so he made a decision Roosevelt had avoided explaining. It was the starkest example of how Roosevelt's choices had shaped Truman's presidency, a responsibility handed to him without guidance, forcing him to make the most consequential decision of the century, based on the limited information Roosevelt had left behind. And yet, through each challenge, Truman's confidence grew. He was no longer navigating a storm built by another man's decisions. He was building his own foundation, but he still had one lesson left to learn, one that Roosevelt had never confronted. When a president governs through secrecy, the consequences are not felt by the president who makes the decisions. They are felt by the president who inherits them. And Truman, more than anyone before him, now understood the cost of the decisions Roosevelt left unfinished. By the end of the summer of 1945, Truman had learned more about Roosevelt's final decisions than Roosevelt had ever intended anyone to know. Each choice, each assumption, each unspoken promise formed a kind of inheritance that Truman never asked for, but had no choice but to confront. And the more Truman pieced together, the clearer it became that Roosevelt had governed through instinct, intuition, and a level of personal diplomacy that could not be transferred to another president, not even one serving in the same administration. The war was ending, but the consequences of Roosevelt's final months were only beginning to unfold. Truman understood that if he didn't take control of the situation quickly, the fragile post-war balance Roosevelt had crafted could collapse. And so he forced himself to move forward with a steady hand, even when the past threatened to pull him backward. His greatest challenge was clarifying the ambiguous agreements Roosevelt had left behind. Some advisors urged Truman to maintain Roosevelt's flexible approach. Others warned him that flexibility was no longer possible. Stalin was moving quickly, Churchill was losing influence, and Europe was shifting in ways that required firm, unmistakable policy. Truman weighed each argument carefully, but he knew that the world had changed the moment Roosevelt died. A new era required new leadership. He began with Eastern Europe. Truman pressed the Soviet delegation for transparency, insisting that the promises of free elections be honored. He refused to accept vague declarations of goodwill. This was more than a diplomatic stance. It was a signal that Roosevelt's improvisational strategy had ended. Truman demanded written assurances, enforceable conditions, and public commitments. Stalin resisted, but Truman refused to retreat. These early confrontations laid the groundwork for what would become the central struggle of Truman's presidency, defining America's role in the post-war world. Roosevelt had envisioned a cooperative international system, but much of that vision relied on his personal rapport with foreign leaders. Without him, the system needed structure, clarity, and a president willing to assert American leadership. Truman became that president. Yet even as he worked to stabilize global diplomacy, Truman faced challenges within his own government. Roosevelt's decentralized leadership had created powerful factions inside the administration. Some advisors believed they were the true interpreters of Roosevelt's intentions. Others sought to preserve their influence by invoking Roosevelt's name whenever Truman made a decision they disliked. Truman listened, but he was not intimidated. He respected Roosevelt, but he would not let the memory of a dead president govern the living nation. He made it clear that Roosevelt's legacy was not a set of permanent instructions, but a foundation on which the United States had to build new policies. He reorganized the executive branch, consolidating responsibilities and demanding accountability. He strengthened the National Security Council. He empowered the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He insisted that major decisions be documented, not whispered. And slowly, the government began to shift from Roosevelt's personalized structure to one capable of surviving any transition. This transformation was not easy. In many ways, Truman was completing tasks Roosevelt had never finished. But Truman understood that leadership was not merely about honoring the past. It was about preparing the future. One of the most striking examples of Roosevelt's unfinished business emerged in Asia. When Japan surrendered, Truman faced the monumental task of managing the transition from war to peace. Roosevelt had left no detailed plan for occupation, economic reconstruction, or political reform. The situation required immediate decisions, and Truman was forced to develop a coherent strategy within days. He approved a plan that balanced justice with stability. He insisted on democratic reforms, civil liberties, and economic revitalization. He allowed Japan to retain the emperor as a symbolic figure, a decision Roosevelt had never clarified. Truman's policy ultimately shaped the modern Japanese state and helped establish one of America's most important post-war alliances. Roosevelt's absence was felt in every corner of the Pacific, but Truman's leadership brought order to a situation that could have easily spiraled into chaos. Another challenge Roosevelt left unresolved was the fate of Germany. Roosevelt had agreed to a four-power occupation, but the details were vague. The boundaries between cooperation and division were unclear. As tensions between the Allies grew, Truman found himself making decisions that would define the trajectory of Europe for decades. He recognized early that the United States could not simply withdraw from Europe. The destruction left behind by the war, coupled with the political vacuum created by the collapse of old regimes, required American leadership. Roosevelt had envisioned a world in which the United States played a guiding but not dominant role. Truman understood that dominance was now necessary to preserve stability. This realization led to some of the most important decisions of his presidency: the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, and the support for European independence. These policies would help rebuild the continent, prevent the spread of instability, and establish a foundation for long-term peace. But none of these actions would have been possible had Truman not first confronted the unfinished business Roosevelt had left him. It was through that confrontation that Truman found his footing, his authority, and his global vision. The most personal consequence of Roosevelt's final decisions came not from foreign policy, but from the way Truman reshaped the vice presidency. He knew better than anyone the cost of being kept in the dark. He knew what it meant to walk into the Oval Office without preparation, and he never wanted another vice president to experience the same shock. He met regularly with Alben Barkley. He briefed him on foreign policy, military strategy, and domestic challenges. He insisted that the vice president be included in cabinet discussions. Truman's determination to improve the office came directly from the vacuum Roosevelt had left him, and it forever changed the role of the vice presidency in the American system. By the early months of 1947, Truman had transformed the government into something Roosevelt never built, but perhaps always intended: an administration capable of transitioning from one leader to another without losing coherence. The presidency was no longer a private chamber of secrets known only to one man. It had become a structured institution with continuity, transparency, and resilience. Yet Truman never spoke publicly about the burden Roosevelt had left him. He never criticized the late president's decisions, never revealed the confusion he inherited, never disclosed the private struggle he endured in those early months. He believed that the unity of the nation mattered more than the flaws of the past, and he respected Roosevelt too deeply to tarnish his legacy. But Truman's actions spoke louder than any criticism could. He reorganized the government. He clarified American policy. He demanded documented commitments. He built a system that could outlast personality. The Truman presidency emerged not from Roosevelt's final decisions, but from Truman's willingness to confront and correct them. By the time he left office in 1953, Truman had done something Roosevelt never had the chance to do. He had completed the transition from war to peace. He had established the architecture of the post-war world. He had helped rebuild Europe, define the American-led international order, and set the stage for decades of relative stability. His leadership had been shaped by Roosevelt's absence, but defined by Truman's own clarity. Historians often debate whether Roosevelt would have governed differently had he lived longer. Some argue he would have resolved the ambiguities that troubled Truman. Others believe he would have relied on improvisation for years to come. But what remains undeniable is that Roosevelt's final decisions, brilliant to some, flawed to others, created the crucible in which Truman forged his presidency. And in that crucible, Truman discovered a lesson Roosevelt never had to confront. A president cannot rely solely on instinct. A president cannot build a system dependent on one man's relationships. A president cannot assume that legacy will protect the future. Only structure, clarity, and shared knowledge can. Truman never said this aloud, but his presidency became a testament to the idea. In every policy he enacted, every alliance he strengthened, every reform he introduced, he was responding not only to the challenges of his own time, but to the shortcomings he had inherited. In the end, Roosevelt's final decisions did not break Truman. They shaped him. They forced him to build something stronger. They compelled him to lead with transparency rather than secrecy. And they revealed a truth that still guides American presidents today. What one president leaves unfinished, the next must finish. Truman finished it, quietly, relentlessly. And in doing so, he transformed the presidency into an office capable of surviving any transition, even one as sudden, fragile, and unprepared as the day he first walked into the Oval Office and discovered just how much Roosevelt had left behind. What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more true stories from the hidden corners of history, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel.